In 6 hours and 23 minutes, the state of Texas will execute Cameron Todd Willingham. They will strap him to a gurney in the Huntsville unit, insert IV lines into both arms, and inject him with a 3-drug cocktail designed to stop his heart. He will die for burning his 3 little daughters alive on December 23, 1991. But here's what makes this case absolutely terrifying. The fire science that convicted Cameron Todd Willingham was completely wrong. The investigators who testified against him were using methods that have since been debunked. The evidence that sent him to death row has been proven unreliable. Today, we're diving into one of the most controversial executions in American history. A case that has divided fire experts, legal scholars, and anyone who believes in justice. By the end of this video, you'll have to decide for yourself. Did Texas execute an innocent father? Or did a cold-blooded killer manipulate the system one last time? Make sure you subscribe and hit that bell icon because this case will challenge everything you think you know about forensic science. December 23, 1991, started like any other day in Corsicana, Texas. Cameron Todd Willingham was at home with his 3 daughters, 2-year-old Amber, and 1-year-old twins Carmen and Cameron. His wife Stacy had gone Christmas shopping, leaving Todd alone with the girls. What happened next would destroy 2 families forever. Around 9 a.m., neighbors heard screaming coming from the Willingham house on West 11th Street. They looked outside to see thick black smoke pouring from the windows. The house was on fire. Todd Willingham came running out of the front door, screaming that his babies were inside. He was wearing only jeans, no shirt, no shoes. His hair was singed, his eyebrows were burned off. He had burns on his chest and feet. Neighbors who rushed to help said Todd was hysterical. He kept trying to run back into the burning house to save his daughters. Multiple witnesses had to physically restrain him from running back into the flames. The Corsicana Fire Department arrived within minutes, but it was too late. The house was fully engulfed. By the time firefighters could enter the home, all 3 girls were dead. Amber was found in her parents' bedroom. The twins were discovered in their bedroom, huddled together. The official cause of death was smoke inhalation. But the fire had burned so intensely that the children's bodies were severely burned. The scene was so horrific that even experienced firefighters broke down crying. Cameron Todd Willingham had lost everything. His house was destroyed. His 3 baby girls were dead. And within 24 hours, he would be the prime suspect in their murders. The Corsicana Fire Department called in investigators to determine what caused the fire. This was standard procedure when there were fatalities, especially involving children. What they found would change Cameron Todd Willingham's life forever. Fire investigators arrived at the scene and began examining the burned house. They were looking for clues about where the fire started and what caused it. What they concluded would seem like solid science at the time, but would later be proven completely wrong. The lead investigator was Deputy Fire Marshal Manuel Vasquez. He had been investigating fires for years and was considered an expert. Vasquez examined the burn patterns on the walls and floors. He looked at the damage to the windows and doors. He studied how the fire had spread through the house. Based on his investigation, Vasquez reached a shocking conclusion. This was no accident. Someone had deliberately set this fire. Someone had used an accelerant like gasoline to make sure the fire burned fast and hot. Someone had committed arson. The evidence seemed clear to investigators. They found what they called pour patterns on the floor, areas where they believed gasoline had been poured before being lit. They found crazed glass in the windows, which they said was caused by rapid heating from an accelerant. They found burn patterns that they claimed could only be caused by arson. Most damning of all, investigators said they found evidence that the fire had multiple points of origin. In other words, fires had been set in different rooms at the same time. This was considered proof that someone had deliberately spread accelerant throughout the house and lit multiple fires. There was only one problem with this investigation. Almost every conclusion they reached was wrong. But in 1991, Cameron Todd Willingham and his defense attorneys didn't know that. The fire science that convicted him was accepted as reliable by courts across America. Fire investigators were considered experts whose word was rarely questioned. Within days of the fire, Cameron Todd Willingham was arrested and charged with 3 counts of capital murder. The state of Texas alleged that he had deliberately set fire to his house, murdering his 3 daughters in cold blood. To understand this case, you need to understand who Cameron Todd Willingham really was. because the man described by prosecutors was very different from the man his friends and family knew. Cameron was born in 1968 in Oklahoma. He came from a working-class family and wasn't particularly successful in school. He had a troubled relationship with his father and struggled with authority figures throughout his life. By the time he was a teenager, Cameron had developed problems with alcohol and had several run-ins with the law. But those who knew Cameron best said he loved his children more than anything in the world. His wife Stacy would later testify that Cameron was a devoted father who played with the girls, changed diapers, and was actively involved in their care. However, Cameron Todd Willingham was not a perfect man. He had a temper. He and Stacy fought frequently, often loudly. Some neighbors described their relationship as volatile. Cameron had been known to drink too much and get into arguments. These character flaws would become central to the prosecution's case. They painted Cameron as an angry, violent man who was overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for 3 small children. A man who might snap and do the unthinkable. But was Cameron Todd Willingham capable of murdering his own children? The people who knew him best were divided. Some said absolutely not. He loved those girls too much. Others said they weren't sure. His behavior could be unpredictable when he was drinking or angry. The prosecution would argue that on December 23, 1991, Cameron Todd Willingham made a calculated decision to kill his 3 daughters and collect on their life insurance policies. They said he poured gasoline throughout the house, set multiple fires, and then escaped, leaving his babies to die. The defense would argue that Cameron was a grieving father who had lost everything in a tragic accident. They said he was being railroaded by investigators who needed someone to blame for an unthinkable tragedy. The truth was somewhere in between, and it would take years to emerge. Cameron Todd Willingham's trial began in August 1992, just 8 months after the fire that killed his daughters. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on fire science and character assassination. The star witness was Deputy Fire Marshal Manuel Vasquez, the lead investigator. Vasquez testified with complete confidence about what he found at the scene. He explained the pour patterns, the crazed glass, the multiple points of origin. He told the jury that this fire was definitely arson, and that Cameron Todd Willingham was the only person who could have set it. The prosecution also called other fire investigators who supported Vasquez's conclusions. They presented photographs of burn patterns and explained how these patterns proved the fire was intentionally set. To the jury, this seemed like overwhelming scientific evidence. But the prosecution didn't stop with fire science. They also attacked Cameron's character. They called witnesses who testified about his drinking, his temper, his arguments with his wife. They suggested that Cameron was an angry, violent man who was capable of killing his own children. Most damaging of all, they called witnesses who claimed Cameron had behaved strangely after the fire. Some said he didn't seem upset enough about his daughter's deaths. Others said he was more concerned about his car than his children. One witness claimed Cameron had asked about life insurance policies just hours after the fire. The defense team tried to fight back, but they were overwhelmed. Cameron's court-appointed attorneys had limited resources and no fire experts of their own. They couldn't effectively challenge the scientific evidence that formed the core of the prosecution's case. They presented character witnesses who testified that Cameron loved his daughters and would never hurt them. They pointed out that he had tried to save the girls and had been burned in the process. They argued that his behavior after the fire was consistent with shock and grief, not guilt. But without their own fire experts to challenge the arson evidence, the defense was fighting an uphill battle. The scientific evidence seemed overwhelming. The character evidence painted Cameron as a potential killer. After deliberating for less than an hour, the jury found Cameron Todd Willingham guilty of 3 counts of capital murder. The judge sentenced him to death. Cameron Todd Willingham, at just 23 years old, was headed to death row for murdering his 3 baby daughters. Cameron Todd Willingham arrived at death row in Huntsville, Texas. In 1992, he would spend the next 12 years there, maintaining his innocence and watching as his appeals were rejected one by one. Life on death row was brutal. Cameron was locked in a small cell for 23 hours a day. He was allowed 1 hour of recreation in a small outdoor cage. Visits were limited and conducted through thick glass. Every day, he knew he was one step closer to execution. But Cameron didn't give up. He spent his time reading, writing letters, and working with his attorneys on appeals. He maintained his innocence in every interview, every letter, every legal filing. He insisted that he was a grieving father, not a killer. During his years on death row, Cameron's case began to attract attention from legal advocates and journalists. Some people started questioning whether the fire science used to convict him was reliable. But these questions came too late to help with his appeals. Meanwhile, his relationship with his wife Stacy completely fell apart. At first, Stacy supported Cameron and visited him regularly. She testified at his trial that she believed he was innocent. But over time, the pressure became too much. In 1999, Todd Willingham filed for divorce. She had remarried and wanted to move on with her life. More devastatingly for Cameron, she changed her story about his innocence. In her divorce proceedings, Stacy suggested that she now believed Cameron might have killed their daughters. This was a crushing blow to Cameron. The one person whose opinion mattered most to him no longer believed in his innocence. He was truly alone. But Cameron continued to fight. He worked with new attorneys who began questioning the fire science more aggressively. They found experts who disagreed with the original investigation. They discovered that fire science had evolved significantly since 1991. However, Texas courts were reluctant to revisit old cases based on new scientific understanding. Cameron's appeals were rejected repeatedly. His execution date was set for February 17, 2004. As that date approached, Cameron Todd Willingham faced the reality that he was going to die for crimes he insisted he didn't commit. But he never stopped proclaiming his innocence. While Cameron Todd Willingham sat on death row, fire science was undergoing a revolution. Researchers were discovering that many of the methods used to investigate fires in the 1980s and 1990s were completely unreliable. The poor patterns that investigators thought proved gasoline had been used. Scientists learned these patterns could be created by perfectly normal fires under certain conditions. The crazed glass that was supposed to indicate rapid heating? This could happen in any house fire when windows were exposed to heat, and then cooled quickly by firefighters' water. Most importantly, researchers learned that fires could appear to have multiple points of origin, even when they started from a single source. Hot gases could travel through a house, igniting materials in different rooms almost simultaneously. What looked like evidence of arson was actually normal fire behavior. In 2004, just months before Cameron's scheduled execution, a group of fire experts reviewed his case. Led by Dr. Gerald Hurst, a renowned fire scientist, they concluded that there was no reliable evidence that the Willingham fire was arson. Everything used to convict Cameron could be explained by accidental causes. Dr. Hurst's report was devastating to the prosecution's case. He found that every single piece of fire evidence was either misinterpreted or based on outdated science. The poor patterns weren't poor patterns. The multiple origins weren't evidence of arson. The burn patterns were consistent with an accidental fire. Dr. Hurst concluded that Cameron Todd Willingham had been convicted based on junk science. The methods used in 1991 were the best available at the time, but they were wrong. Tragically wrong. This report was submitted to Texas authorities just before Cameron's execution, but it was too late to stop what was about to happen. The legal system had already decided Cameron Todd Willingham's fate. On February 17, 2004, despite the new scientific evidence raising serious questions about his guilt, Cameron Todd Willingham was executed by the state of Texas. February 17, 2004 began like every other day on death row, except everyone knew it would be Cameron Todd Willingham's last. He had spent 12 years fighting for his life, and now his time was up. Cameron spent his final morning writing letters and meeting with his spiritual advisor. He continued to maintain his innocence, just as he had for over 12 years. He wrote a final letter to his parents, telling them he loved them and thanking them for believing in him. His last meal was simple: a cheeseburger, French fries, and a Coca-Cola. Some condemned inmates choose elaborate final meals, but Cameron kept it basic. Throughout the day, protesters gathered outside the Huntsville unit. Some carried signs reading, "Execute Willingham," while others held signs saying, "Innocent man." The case had divided people who followed it closely. At 6 p.m., Cameron Todd Willingham was led from his cell to the execution chamber. He was strapped to a gurney and 4 lines were inserted into both arms. Through the thick glass, he could see the witnesses who had come to watch him die. The warden asked if he had any final words. Cameron Todd Willingham looked toward the witness room where some of his victims' family members sat. He spoke clearly and forcefully. I am an innocent man convicted of a crime I did not commit. I have been persecuted for 12 years for something I did not do. From God's dust I came, and to dust I will return. So the earth shall become my throne. I gotta go, Road Dogg. I love you, Gabby. Those last words were directed at his girlfriend, Eugenia Willingham, who had supported him throughout his time on death row. At 6:20 p.m., the lethal injection began. The first drug, sodium pentothal, was designed to render him unconscious. The second drug, pancuronium bromide, would paralyze his muscles. The third drug, potassium chloride, would stop his heart. At 6:27 p.m., Cameron Todd Willingham was pronounced dead. He was 36 years old. Cameron Todd Willingham's execution didn't end the controversy surrounding his case. If anything, it made it worse. In the months and years that followed, more fire experts reviewed his case and reached the same conclusion. There was no reliable evidence of arson. In 2005, the Texas Forensic Science Commission began investigating whether Cameron had been executed based on flawed science. This investigation would take years and reveal disturbing problems with how fire investigations were conducted in Texas. The commission hired Dr. Craig Baylor, another fire expert, to review the case. Dr. Baylor's report was even more damning than Dr. Hurst's. He concluded that the original investigation was not just wrong, but deeply flawed and based on folklore rather than science. Dr. Baylor found that every conclusion reached by the original investigators was wrong. There was no evidence of pour patterns, no evidence of accelerants, and no evidence of multiple origins. The fire could easily have been caused by a space heater, faulty wiring, or any number of accidental causes. Most shocking of all, Dr. Baylor concluded that a proper fire investigation in 1991 should have reached these same conclusions. The science existed at the time to conduct a better investigation, but the investigators had used outdated and unreliable methods. In 2009, just days before the Texas Forensic Science Commission was scheduled to hear Dr. Baylor's report, Texas Governor Rick Perry replaced several commission members. Critics accused Perry of trying to prevent the commission from concluding that Texas had executed an innocent man. The political controversy grew when it was revealed that Perry had received Dr. Hurst's report questioning the evidence before Cameron's execution but had chosen not to grant a reprieve. Perry defended his decision, saying he believed Cameron was guilty based on other evidence. But what other evidence? The character witnesses who said Cameron didn't seem upset enough? The claims that he was more concerned about his car than his children? These subjective observations hardly seemed sufficient to justify execution when the scientific evidence was so questionable. Today, nearly 20 years after Cameron Todd Willingham's execution, his case continues to generate controversy and debate. Fire experts are virtually unanimous in their conclusion that there was no reliable evidence of arson. Legal scholars have called his execution one of the worst miscarriages of justice in American history. But questions remain. If Cameron didn't set the fire, what caused it? Investigators have suggested several possibilities. A faulty space heater, defective wiring, or even one of the children playing with matches or a lighter. Any of these could have caused a fire that spread quickly through the small house. Was Cameron Todd Willingham a perfect man? Absolutely not. He had a temper, he drank too much, and he argued with his wife. But being flawed doesn't make someone a killer. Thousands of imperfect fathers managed to raise their children without murdering them. The tragedy of Cameron Todd Willingham's case extends beyond one man's execution. It represents a systemic failure of the criminal justice system. Bad science was accepted without question. Defense attorneys lacked resources to challenge expert testimony. Appeals courts were reluctant to revisit convictions based on new scientific understanding. Most importantly, it shows how the death penalty's finality makes it impossible to correct mistakes. If Cameron Todd Willingham had been sentenced to life in prison, he could have been exonerated when the science changed. Instead, he's dead, and we can never know with absolute certainty whether justice was served. Cameron Todd Willingham maintained his innocence until his final breath. He died believing that someday, people would learn the truth about what happened on December 23, 1991. He may have been right. The question that haunts Texas today is simple. Did the state execute an innocent father, or did a killer manipulate the system one last time? Based on the scientific evidence, the answer seems clear. But Cameron Todd Willingham can never be brought back to tell his side of the story. What do you think? Was Cameron Todd Willingham guilty of murdering his daughters, Or was he the victim of junk science and a rush to judgment? Let me know in the comments below. And if this case has made you think about the reliability of forensic evidence and the finality of the death penalty, make sure you subscribe for more deep dives into controversial cases that challenge our understanding of justice. Sometimes the truth is more complicated than it appears. And sometimes by the time we figure it out, it's too late.